Hello fellow sim racers. Last week I previewed the upcoming P13c Prototype for Assetto Corsa by IER Simulations. The car generated quite a lot of interest and speculation from the community, mainly due to the way in which IER have utilised the shaders mod to significantly revise the physics of Assetto Corsa in order to address some of the shortcomings of the unmodded sim. With such a significant reworking, there's a lot to discuss. So today's video is a deep dive into the physics, systems and design philosophy of the P13c, as told by Jackson, the team lead from IER. And to head off the inevitable questions in the comments, the planned release date for the car is this Sunday, the 20th of October.
The idea was kind of to design the most, I guess, technically realistic LMP car in any simulation that's available, which involved a lot of code writing and things like that that you would normally do in a project for any simulator, really. So for a race car of this type, usually if you're a team that owns it, you get sent basically a really big PDF, and it has more or less everything you need to know about the car, or everything the manufacturer thinks you need to know about the car. And one of those things is something called an Aeromap. It's basically a 2D plot of ride heights, which are the X and Y axis, and then either coefficient of lift or coefficient of drag, which is on the Z. And what that effectively shows you is the car's sensitivity to movement with the aero, and it gives you, I guess, a goal to look forward to for your ride heights at speed. The Kunos, it's called a wing system they use, it's simple, but it works to a point. So like for another LMP car I did, within like the normal sort of operating range, everything was within, I think, maybe 1% or 2%, maybe 3% sensitivity to the real Aeromap, which itself can be, more than that off just because of inaccuracies in CFD or depending how they did it. But you try to match the data that you have and then go from there. So it was good in that area, but you got to points where, say, the front diffuser started to stall, or the front diffuser would get low enough that it started to stall the rear. And you couldn't really effectively do that in the vanilla Assetto Corsa version. The next stepping point, I guess, then is to make what's essentially an Aeromap in your simulator. So the first thing we did for the patch was, all right, I know how I want this to be implemented, and now let's just go for it. So essentially what we ended up doing is we created this Aeromap system. You can have as many as you want. Really, you should only need one. And maybe if you want like a configuration change of the car, like let's say you have a different front diffuser, you can have 2, and then in the setup you can change it. It's kind of like the wing system. So, and that'll change, instead of one wing angle, which is what happens with the typical Kunos setup, it'll change the entire Aeromap. So everything can be different. The magnitudes of the downforce and drag, yaw sensitivity, pitch sensitivity, roll sensitivity, with roll being something that wasn't in vanilla AC at all. So essentially what we did was we have the maps for the aero balance, which is the distribution of downforce from front to rear. We have a coefficient of drag map, and we have a coefficient of lift map. And then on top of that, which is kind of the almost more important stuff, because the actual Aeromap itself only really helps, like I said, kind of outside of the operating range or in odd circumstances. The benefits were situations that AC didn't really account for. So one of those is roll sensitivity. And roll sensitivity on a car like this is actually very significant. And it's part of the reason you'll see LMP cars and open wheelers running very, very stiff front anti-roll bars. And it's to keep the roll of the car low, because at high roll angles, the downforce basically just goes away. We also added some kind of interesting features. So I think ACC added it as well. It's kind of a delay to aero forces. So if you think about it, it takes the air kind of finite amount of time to catch up to wherever the car is positioned. So if you're, say, oscillating, 1 centimeter up and down, the aero's kind of gonna fall behind that in some way. So we essentially have force delays to kind of filter that movement out and give you a bit of an average. So it's a lot of stuff like that, which helps over, like, say, Sebring, where you get a lot of instantaneous ride height changes that in real life, yeah, they affect the car, but it's not boom, 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 boom. The actual coefficients of lift aren't changing instantaneously. Let's start with Assetto Corsa for your inputs for what's essentially your spring rate of the car is actually the wheel rate of the car, which is well known by pretty much everyone that makes a car. And what a wheel rate is you have your spring and it's mechanically linked to your wheel hub in some fashion. But if you think about it, the mechanical leverage of that linkage may not be 1-to-1 with how much the spring is actually compressed. So you get this thing called a motion ratio, which is essentially the mechanical advantage of the system. So let's say, and I always forget which direction it is, whether it's wheel travel to damper or the other way around. But let's say your wheel moves 2 centimeters up, but your spring only compresses by 1 centimeter. Now you have a 2-to-1 motion ratio. And previously in Assetto Corsa, that had to be baked into your quote spring rate, which is just your wheel rate. The problem with that is if you have a car with a rocker arm, so the P13 in concept, not that it was a real car or anything, the P13 it has a push rod that goes to a rocker that then goes to a spring. Very conventional LMP setup for the time period, so 2013. This was kind of before everybody moved to torsion bar, because now I think everybody at the front uses torsion bar. The first thing I did with the suspension was add the motion ratio lookup table for suspension travel, which turned out to be a really complicated thing because you look at any documentation on motion ratios and effective wheel rate, and it all says effective wheel rate is spring rate times motion ratio squared. What they don't tell you, and that you have to kind of think about, is that it's actually not motion ratio squared. It's motion ratio times, it's essentially instantaneous motion ratio times average motion ratio. Because if you think about it, as you rotate the rocker, your motion ratio is changing. So if you say 2 centimeters of suspension travel, your motion ratio goes from 1.07 to 1.05. Your average is 1.06, but your instantaneous at the end of it is 1.05. So it's actually 1.05 times 1.06 instead of some single number squared. So that's actually very difficult or annoying thing to code, as I found out. But the nice thing is that it allows you to now in the setup menu, instead of seeing a number that doesn't really make sense to most people, or it makes sense, but it doesn't correspond to a real life measurement, you can look at it and now it's the actual spring rate. So on the P13, it's all in pounds per inch. Other stuff, there's a bump stop lookup table, which for this car, super unimportant because it never hits the bump stops. But essentially what the problem with bump stops in the vanilla Kunos implementation was that they're a static rate. Problem with that is once you get on the bump stop, it's instantaneous spring rate change, which will upset the car pretty significantly. In reality, since it's rubber, the spring rate essentially increases as you push into it. Whereas Kunos, the original implementation, there would just be a straight line going across the graph, which isn't ideal. So it makes it a bit less sensitive to running on the bump stops, a bit more compliance there. The dampers, this was something that ACC added as well. Dampers in Assetto Corsa were previously, there were essentially two rates. So it got to the knee point, quote knee point of the damper, and then it would change its rate from slow bump or rebound to fast bump or rebound. Where in real life, it's kind of just a smooth curve, or it might change twice, or it might have a blow-off valve or something like that. So what the solution to that is just having a lookup table that says, all right, this is the force at this velocity, because dampers are velocity dependent. This is the force at this velocity. This is the force at this velocity, this is the force at this velocity, instead of having, all right, this is the rate up until this velocity, constant, and this is the rate after this velocity, constant. It just allows for a bit more accurate of a calculation for the suspension damping. And really, it's such a minimal change, especially for this car. It runs so stiff. I think this car's ride frequency without the third springs is like 4 or 5 hertz, which is 4 times a road car. And then with the third springs, the third springs are probably doubling that. So you don't really notice that much. But it was something neat to add. I think the biggest noticeable thing would probably be the influence of, I guess, the slip angle and slip ratio curves. So you can adjust the drop off of those, and the friction, the peak friction of them, where grip is the highest, is going to be pretty similar throughout any of David's stuff, any of my stuff, probably most of the VRC stuff. Even the Kuno stuff is pretty close to ours. But the drop off past the peak might be different, or say like there's a variable in there that Kuno's, that their the number they use for that variable, it basically adds rolling resistance with slip, which like if you spin up your tires, it's going to add rolling resistance. And in real life, that's not really a thing. And it's stuff like that. And then you get like a lot of the minor stuff. Like there's a speed sensitivity. Basically, the slip speed of the tire influences its grip. I use a lower value than Kunos does for that, but there's no data on it, so it's kind of up in the air. Stuff like relaxation length, which basically tells you, I guess, the reactivity of the tire. So the lower the relaxation length means the more responsive the tire. So on road cars, I'll use, not that I have any released, but on road cars, I'll use a higher value than Kunos by a significant amount. Race cars, it's about the same. There's the camber curve, which is on most Kunos tires about half a degree to a degree too low as far as the optimum goes, depending on the car, of course. But if you actually, like the GT3 cars, for example, I think the optimal setup camber-wise for most tracks in those cars is actually negative 2.5 or something at the front in vanilla AC, whereas real life they're running negative 3.5 or negative 4, depending on the car. And that was fixed for ACC, but it's stuff like that, and just a lot of little stuff, mostly. And then the biggest thing from, I guess, a technical standpoint, but not necessarily from a feel standpoint, is the load sensitivity of the tires. So tires are kind of weird in that most compounds have a single friction coefficient. Given a set temperature, tires are very strange in general from a physical standpoint, in that the more load you add, the less the friction coefficient is, which is just a very strange, if you think about it, effect, because it doesn't apply to anything that I know of anyway in real life. Real tires, the more load you put on, the less efficient they become with producing grip from that load. The Kunos model for that, it's not sensitive enough at medium loads, and at low loads it's far too sensitive. So essentially you get way too much grip at super low load, so no load to say 2,000 newtons, and then at like say 5,000 you have too little grip, 5,000 newtons, and then at 10,000 you have way too much grip. So that applies really heavily for stuff like their LMP1 cars, which have honestly plenty wrong with them as it stands, but the actual cornering speed potential difference is massive. So David and I think the VRC guys do as well. We use the lookup tables for those load sensitivity curves. So basically it allows us to use correct downforce and then still have correct cornering speeds instead of using lowered downforce, and then the tires will make up the grip, but then your ride heights are off, etc. The P13 drives pretty much like a car in ACC would, and David's stuff drives pretty similarly, although he kind of aligns more to Kuno's content just because they try to, it makes more sense for them, I guess, from a business standpoint, just to have their cars be more familiar to the end user, which wasn't really the goal with this car in particular for us. So I kind of just went for it. But at the end of the day, it's not a huge difference anyway. It'll still feel like a car. So I think the main problem with the Kunos model was that the temperatures just kind of weren't. It was a similar situation to the brakes, where it was essentially missing an interface, a temperature interface, which was the carcass temperature of the tire. So if you think about a tire, you have different layers. You have the inner air, which Kunos calls the core. You have the outer surface, which Kunos calls the surface. But then you have the carcass, which is basically everything in between that. So it's, you can arbitrarily say how much you want the surface to be. Let's say 3 millimeters, something like that. Well, you have another 10 of rubber before you get to the core. And in vanilla Assetto Corsa, that's just not there. So what we did, I essentially just rewrote the thermal model. It has that carcass temperature. It has some other things that I'm not going to go into that make the temperature generation a bit more realistic. And the goal was to just get something that was more representative of real life, and it kind of made tire management and setup a bit more important. So it's minimal, but you can change the dampers and your tire temperatures will correlate to whatever change you did. So say you stiffen them up, and that means your tires actually move a bit more, then you're going to get a bit more heat. I added some other stuff to basically change the behavior of the tire as temperature changed. So at slower speeds, it's a bit more, it's actually at really low speeds, it goes into a glass state, which is just the rubber not really being rubber at that point. And then once you get past, I think that stops at like 20 Celsius or something, so it doesn't really matter. But above 40 Celsius, the tire starts to behave kind of properly. And then when you overheat it, it starts to become more fluid, I guess, less responsive, stuff like that. The Kunos system for brakes is actually pretty good. I mean, there's not that much to a braking system insofar as what you can do in a simulator. That makes sense, because really a lot of what you're limited by is the hardware. So really what I decided to do for the brakes of the P13 and then the patch by extension was fix the temperature model. So this was something I talked to Stefano about, actually, and sent them some data for. And it's something that got added to ACC as well. So if you think about a brake, right, and you have some amount of exterior contact friction surface, and the inside is a bunch of metal that never gets touched by anything, but retains temperature. So the problem with Assetto Corsa, vanilla Assetto Corsa brakes, is that the only temperature interface it has is between that surface, that very small amount of, I guess, usually metal, in this case, carbon, but it's this very thin strip to the air, and that's the only interface that Assetto Corsa has. So the problem was, every time you would brake, and I don't think I have a graph for this, but once you got under the straight, it would try to converge to the ambient temperature of the air. So let's say 23 Celsius. So you'd brake all the way to 800 degrees Celsius in the corner, go down in the straight, and it's trying to get to that 23 point. The problem is, on a real brake, the heat from that finite small surface gets transferred to the, quote, core of the brake. So it's that inner metal, I guess you could think of it as. And that inner metal will start getting hot. And the reason brakes are ventilated throughout is so that that temperature doesn't get too hot, because then your brakes will become incredibly inefficient and possibly shatter. You have this core temperature of this larger mass of metal or the compound influencing the outer contact surface. So what happens on a real brake when you're on the straight is, instead of converging to your ambient air temperature, 23 Celsius, it converges to somewhere between your ambient air temperature and the core temperature of the brake, and it's actually closer to the core temperature than the ambient air. So instead of trying to get to 23 Celsius, it's trying to get to 230 Celsius or 300 Celsius or 400 Celsius. So when you went and tried to match telemetry data with the vanilla AC, it was impossible, because you're just missing a component of the equation. So what we did for the patch was basically rewrite the thermal model, just to add that component. It wasn't anything groundbreaking. We kept it pretty similar. And now temperatures are actually pretty important to manage, so we also added a blanking system to the brake. So you have the air ducts at the front of the car and the rear of the car, and you can block them off by a percentage, and it'll either increase the cooling to the brakes or decrease the cooling to the brakes. So you keep that core temperature at the spot where it's optimum. And I think on most carbon brakes, it's between 300 and 500 Celsius when you hit the pedal. But yeah, so that was the main thing, just getting it to a point where the core temperature was reasonably accurate to data we had, and then you could start adding brake blanking and stuff like that to sort of make the experience a bit fuller, really, because previously in Assetto Corsa, you didn't really have to worry about the brakes at all, and they didn't affect anything majorly because there was fade on some cars, but there's nothing you can do about it and stuff like that. So we get that to be a bigger part of the picture, because in real life it's a pretty major concern, and the amount of blanking you have on your ducts is pretty important. Like, you go to Mosport, for example, and you're almost, well, some cars are almost completely blanked off. The P13, I think it's 90% blanking on the front, 100% on the rear, because you get enough cooling just from the wheels rotating. But then you go to, say, a Long Beach, and everything's wide open because you need as much cooling as possible, because there's a lot of braking energy on that circuit. The vanilla traction control in Assetto Corsa is, you essentially say what slip ratio the traction control kicks in at, and that's it. You say the frequency it kicks in as well. So it'll get to that slip ratio, cut the engine completely. After the next frequency tick, it'll reevaluate whether or not you're at that slip ratio still, and then it'll decide on whether or not it wants to cut the engine or continue going. And that's why if you ever get on the TC and they see it's just and it kills your exit speed, which is why a lot of guys don't really use it, or they'll use it on something really low that just saves them if they start to spin. The way that works out, real life traction control is significantly more complicated than the vanilla implementation. So in real life, yeah, you have your slip ratio, your target essentially. You don't want to go above it. You can be below it, but that's where the optimum grip is. That's where you want it to be. But then maybe you're in third gear, and in fifth gear corners, you don't really want any traction control because the chances of you spinning are pretty low. Well, third gear corners, you have a lot more force going to the wheels just because the gear ratio is involved. And now, all right, well, now I want the traction control to kick in a lot more because I'll be spinning otherwise. Or let's say, all right, well, I like a bit of slip out of the corner, but not too much to the point where I have to do counter steer. So we'll set it so that it cuts in at a certain yaw angle. Essentially, it's just a complete rewrite. So you can take in lateral G and say, okay, this is what I want the traction control to do to its target slip, or the amount it's cutting under this lateral G or this lateral G or no lateral G. And it's taking in every input the car has from its telemetry or ECU or whatever, and turning that into something that tells the ECU then, all right, we should be cutting the engine by this much because, in 0.2 of a second, the car is going to be slipping more or whatever. So on the P13, we have 6 controllers. One's just the slip ratio essentially, and then the first knob on the steering wheel, which is the original AC setting. There's one that looks at the speed of the car, the amount of gas used, the amount of throttle used. There's one that looks at the lateral G, and then that one also goes with the second knob on the car, which that one, so I guess to break down those, it's actually in the setup description now on the setup menu. But the traction control one for the P13 is basically the same as every other Assetto Corsa version. So it's where the TC cuts in a straight line scenario. Traction control 2, on the other hand, is not like the Ferrari's ACC implementation. It's not how much it cuts. It's actually in yaw. So when you're starting to slip sideways, it's how much it either cuts in then or how early it cuts in, and that it adjusts kind of that threshold. And that's kind of the main thing drivers use to tune their car on exits, because once you get to a pretty comfortable base setting, that first TC1 setting, TC2 becomes kind of a fine-tuning aspect of that. Kunos's fuel system is reasonable. So power in an engine is essentially proportional to RPM, and the way Kunos calculates your fuel usage is some constant times. It's a mathematical formula related to a linear power calculation. In real life, the engine, its fuel usage is proportional to power. So if you look at a real power curve, it's very much not linear. So you get some interesting behavior where you're burning all of your power or all of your fuel, and you're not at the optimum power, because your engine is thermally less efficient at that RPM than it is at a different RPM or stuff like that, which is a tricky thing to model because you need to know the thermal efficiency of your engine, which nobody releases that. But you also need to know the energy density of the fuel. The way I wrote the system was, it looks at the power, it takes that power curve, it takes in a mechanical efficiency number, which is essentially drivetrain losses. I didn't want to do a lookup table for that because nobody has data on drivetrain losses anyway, so it wouldn't really have helped much. I might add it in the future if I have any tangible data to go with it, but probably not. Anyway, so you have your power curve, you have your mechanical efficiency, which is basically telling it how much power the engine is actually producing, how much versus how much power it's producing at the wheels, which is what the wheel power is what you input into Assetto Corsa. So for this car, and a lot of race cars in general, they actually will run some throttle at idle. So on a road car, if you think about it, it kind of won't do that necessarily. Like, it'll shut off its throttle on coast and just let the engine run, and then when you apply throttle, it'll be fine, or it'll use 1% or 2%. And then when you're stopped, it'll use idle throttle to keep the engine running. This car runs at 8% throttle all the time. You add that parameter, then you have to have a lookup table for your thermal efficiency of your engine, which is how much energy is burned versus how much energy you get out. And it's actually looking at it the other way around. So it's looking at how much energy you get out being the power curve of the car. So then it's back calculating that to decide how much energy you're actually burning in terms of fuel. And then you need what's called the lower heating value of your fuel, which for this car, it's E10, so 10% ethanol, so it's about 41.7 megajoules per kilogram. And then that's it. You don't need to figure out the constant value for the Kunos version. It's just done after that. So I had a quote from an LMP1 team that said a very similar car to this ran at 4.5. They put it in miles per gallon, which, irrelevant units, but that's fine. It was 4.5 miles per gallon a lap at Sebring on like a qualifying lap, essentially. And I plugged all the data in, and I was praying that would work properly. And I get in game, and it's like, I don't remember what it was. It might have been 11 point something. And I was like, okay, that's not great. Turns out I missed a division of something. And then I go back in game, and it was 4.5 on the dot. So the fact that it was that close was essentially spot on as far as I was concerned, was really cool. Fuel consumption system. It doesn't become more important, but it kind of brings to light the fact that in real life they run different engine configurations or different fuel maps, as they're called, for different scenarios. So this car has 8 fuel maps, with 1 being the qualifying map, essentially 7 being a pretty low power map. So you're about 8.5% power down at map 7. In theory, if you wanted to start saving fuel without having to drive like you're saving fuel, you can just change the map and you'll be down on power, and being down on power means you're burning less fuel, which means you're burning less fuel and you can last longer on track. So the setup, it was trying to make things make more sense, almost make things more accessible, more understandable to a degree. So a big, I wouldn't say problem, but maybe unfortunate design quality of the original Assetto Corsa was that you couldn't change descriptions. Essentially, the idea was either customizing it for the car itself or just providing a description for a new element. We added a system that basically you write in the setup file and it'll just show that description. So for the front bodywork, for example, of the car, it has 6 settings, I think. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, 6 settings. Basically just different configurations, different dive planes, stuff like that. And this now describes all of those in depth and what tracks you might want to use them at, things like that, instead of it just being either a generic front wing description or nothing at all.
So guys, I hope you all enjoyed that. The level of detail that's gone into the P13c is, as you've heard, really something else, and I can't wait for you guys to get the chance to drive it. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, it would be great if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this in the future. So all that's left to say is goodbye, thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of the day.